Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you have ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. I am your host, Pattie Porter. My guest hosts, Dina Zametta and Stephen Kotev, along with our guest experts, will share our experiences, raise your awareness, and give you food for thought. We will share with you problem-solving strategies no matter what your situation is. At work, with neighbors or friends, family, and business partners. Tune in or join in the conversation every Tuesday evening. Well, welcome back, listeners, to our live conflict chat. And I'm your host, Pattie Porter, along with my special hosts, Tracy Culbreath King and Abigail McManus. Now, we are learning along the way this year that we've been doing our live conflict chats every last Tuesday of every month. And we'll highlight conflict-related topics that the ordinary person deals with in their daily lives, and maybe the things that we see or hear in the news or we experience personally ourselves, things that we hear through our social networks or our Yahoo newsletter updates. But the thing about it is the conflict chat is about you, listener. What are the situations that you're dealing with that you want conflict management expert guidance, right? But today we're really going to be topping off our topic on wedding conflicts. This whole month of June has been about wedding conflicts, and we've had some great guests to talk about how do you deal with those kinds of situations. So if you are on the computer and you're listening, we've got the chat room open right now. Just scroll down the page. You'll see the chat room's open. We'd love to hear your comments or your questions there. You can also call in at 347-324-3591. Important that you press the 1 key so we know that you would like to speak with us. Or if you are listening and you want to follow our Twitter feed and engage with us that way, use the hashtag ConflictChat. Or tweet us at TXConflictCoach. There are various ways in which to get engaged with us today. And you can listen to all of our archive programs at TexasConflictCoach.com, where you can hear the prior episodes on wedding conflict with, I believe we had Marriage Prep 101 and The Wedding Lawyer. So great episodes in which Abby and Tracy hosted. So Tracy and Abby, wasn't that exciting?
It was.
It was really fun.
Well, what made it fun then for you? Because y'all are both are y'all still considered newlyweds? I still consider you newlyweds myself. So what made that fun?
I think it's safe to say we're both still considered newlyweds.
Yeah, definitely. But it was a lot. Sorry, I was just going to say it was a lot of fun just because we're newlyweds. So it's nice to have. We had just got done planning our own wedding, so it was nice to hear, especially last week with Christy, all the wedding issues that come up with other brides, and to be on the other side now was nice. Okay. And what about for you, Tracy?
It was really fun too, also to be able to relate to some of the issues that may have come up when we were speaking with Christy Aslan, who was a wedding lawyer. She talked about some of the things you may encounter, those top issues. And so it was nice to have someone say, these are some of the issues that you may encounter when you're planning your wedding or you're newly engaged, and here are some strategies and tools that you can use. Although we are already married, I have friends who are just getting engaged, and there are weddings that I will actually be a bridesmaid or a maid of honor for. So all the information that I got from hosting the program is going to be really helpful moving forward to help my friends.
Yeah. Well, what was the one thing that really stood out for you that you wished you had known about or had a strategy for when you were planning y'all's weddings? After you listened to the two of them, what stood out for y'all?
I think for me, I think that planning a wedding, just in general, and your first year of marriage, there's a lot of challenges that couples face. And it was nice to hear that couples are not alone. These are common issues that a lot of engaged couples and, everybody, it's nice to know that there's more than just one. You're not the only couple that are experiencing these. And I think the other thing that was really I heard in both of the programs was to communicate. Communication was a huge thing, whether it was with your spouse or your future spouse, or whether it was with your in-laws, or if it was with your vendors. Communication was huge throughout both programs.
Okay, good. And what about for you, Tracy?
For me, I would say that communication also was a really big one for me, and I feel like communication often is the main cause for conflict, and it's really important that both of our programs highlighted that. And I also think for me, what was really resounding when we had the wedding lawyer on was her big thing was think about what you want on your wedding day and what you want your day to look like. Because all through the wedding planning process, I was trying really hard to, do that and make sure that we were incorporated into our wedding, right? And there were also a lot of people who wanted to be a part of the special day, and they had their own ideas. And so it was really nice to have somebody else affirm that, it's your wedding day, and you should have it the way you want it to be.
Mm-hmm. I liked Christy, the wedding lawyer. She had that visioning exercise at the end, which is like you said. It was about visioning, like the place that brings you the most joy and happiness. And she really had the listeners, kind of go through that reflection of how did it feel, smell, taste, and then bring that feeling into your wedding. And then let that ground you in terms of your intention, so that if you get lost in the weeds, or you're pulled by in-laws, or pulled by bridesmaids, and pulled by jealousies, and all these things that can pull you in a different direction, it allows you to ground yourself and go back to that vision of this is what my vision is, and this is what I want to have. But the trick is that people don't like to confront, right? It should be surprising, right, that communication should be the number one thing, and yet what it is that people are easily communicating, but when we start making assumptions, or we start having high expectations or low expectations, but we're not communicating those expectations, and we're not clarifying those assumptions, we're just assuming that everyone is on the same page, and then there's, tension, and then all of a sudden we're like, ooh, don't like that, so we don't, instead of communicating more, we communicate less. Yeah,
absolutely.
So that was... Yeah, and I'm sure that y'all could probably, being newlyweds, that was probably fresh in your mind. And we have a new graduate student intern, and she wrote a recent blog about those expectations, and how are those communicated, especially when what you want and wish for your wedding and for your groom is so different from somebody else who's significant, whether that's a grandparent, a parent, in-laws, whoever those other people are, and yet you're such on a different opposite end of the spectrum. So that communication is really key, and the strategy of how do you have that communication when it's a conflict. So, yeah, definitely.
Just to add to that, Patty, I also found that when you do have those disagreements on what the day should be or what the vision should be, when you have different parties that are part of the wedding wanting to add their own things to make it special, I find that if you can communicate what you want and why you want it in a positive and receptive way, understanding the reasons why somebody else wants you to get married at a church, or why someone else wants your send-off to be X, Y, and Z, but being able to be firm in what you want and communicate that in a soft way, people are really receptive to that, and they'll say, you know what, that's great. I can see that you're really passionate about that, and that's really what you want, and it is your day, and I just want to be there for you, and I was just coming from this place, but I can really see. And so it starts to open dialogue when you're open, but you're also firm in what you want.
It's a really good point, because I think that, one of the things, in fact, one of the things, link that we found that we're sharing with listeners tonight is someone who, in fact, I think it was Christy who also mentioned, too, that she was recently newlywed herself, the wedding lawyer, and how something didn't go as she expected, but instead of, attacking, blaming, and why did you do that, and, or giving a really horrible Yelp review or whatever, it's doing exactly what you just said, which is, now hopefully you catch it sooner, but it's doing exactly what you just said, which is to frame it in a way that is not attacking, blaming, because it will just shut down the conversation very quickly. And what you don't want is to have that cake not show up, or the photographer not have film, or you don't want to sabotage what you're really ultimately trying to achieve, for the wedding. So be real smart about how you have that conversation.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about then, listeners. We hear things. It was really funny as we were tweeting over the last month. Abby, you and I have been tweeting a lot and about wedding conflict. And one of the things that really surprised me from the conversations was the whole wedding insurance industry. I'm like, when we talk about pet conflict and we talk about pet insurance, and people like roll their eyes and they're like, "What?" And I'm like, wedding insurance? Really? I had no idea. And, of course, I got married many, many moons ago. That did not exist. But very, very smart thing. So, Tracy, you found something that was up on your Yahoo News. What was trending the other day about brides?
There's an article about a bride who was telling her friend who has red hair that she needed to dye her hair to match the other bridesmaids, and that her hair color would make her stand out and not blend in with the rest of the bridal party because they're all brunette, and it just would clash with the color scheme.
And what was the hair? Did it matter what? Was it like a purple or something? You know how the colors are for weddings. Was it a green color hair or something like that, or?
The article doesn't specifically say what the wedding colors are. It just says that the other bridesmaids all have brunette hair, and that the bride felt like the red-haired friend had attention-grabbing hair, and she really wanted the group to look cohesive. And so her hair color is kind of going against the grain of the look that she's envisioning for her day.
So what was your gut reaction when you read that?
My heart stunk for her. I've never personally experienced a bridezilla like this before, but having someone change who they are for a wedding just really strikes me as almost heartbreaking, because she's saying, well, your hair needs to go because it's just throwing off my wedding aesthetics. Meanwhile, this is the lady's hair. That's who she is. It's the hair color she's had her whole life. If she hasn't dyed her hair now, I highly doubt she wants to do it for someone else. So that really speaks to a whole bunch of experience if she decides to go ahead and dye her hair.
All right. And yet, does that, I wonder, Abby, does that go against the whole thing of, this is my vision. I want my vision. I want my vision is everybody match and they're cohesive. You just said a few minutes ago that meaning listeners are saying, hey, you just said, we're supposed to honor that vision. But when does it go too far, right?
And see, and that's what you were just saying. I mean, it's one thing to have a cohesive, like all the bridesmaids in one matching dresses, or all wearing the same flowers or wearing the same kind of jewelry. But to change your hair color, when I initially read this article, I was kind of shocked by it all, just because, I know it's an honor to be asked to be in someone's wedding, but the person you're asking doesn't necessarily have to say yes, and it just, for them to stand next to you, and I mean, she probably wants to stand next to you, but then to be torn the way, like the article said, between, do I dye my hair or do I not dye my hair? I found this article very shocking, and I think, it's one thing to be cohesive, all wearing the same dresses, but to make someone change their hair, I just think is going a little too far.
I agree, and I also think if she knew about this prior to asking her, she should have talk to her about it too and have a conversation, not have her agree to be in the wedding party and then be like, oh, by the way, I want you to dye your hair, and oh, by the way, I'll pay for it and I'll take you to the lady who does my hair. That's going to make it better for her.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was right there with you. That was one of the things I actually wrote down when I was reading the article, that you can think further in advance and prepare for that situation. So if you're thinking in advance, I really like these colors, but I want to ask, Susie to be in my wedding, if you're going to have that idea beforehand. So it's either you don't ask or you change your colors, or, you just deal with the fact that her hair might be a little bit different. I think you shouldn't have to do this like toss up between the two. So that, like I said, I think you should definitely prepare ahead of time if that's what you're thinking.
Yeah. Right. And it just doesn't sit well asking someone to change who they are as a person to be a part of your day. And I can't imagine what she's feeling either, hearing from one of her best friends saying, hey, your hair is not going to work for me. I need you to change your hair.
Now, can you imagine from this person's perspective about changing her hair, what do you think she was experiencing as a result? What do you think was being undermined for her when, Bridezilla says you need to change and dye your hair? What do you think that tapped into her for her?
It could have been her self-esteem. It could have been her it could go into her body image. You don't know what she's struggling about. Maybe she doesn't like her hair and she's just never admitted it to someone, or maybe she's always loved her hair and now she has this different worldview of what people think of her hair. You just don't know how that impacts her self-esteem, her body image, her sense of self.
Yeah. Well, and like you said earlier, her authenticity, who she is, I guess part of the question is when you're facing this example of, and of course, the media has over time, have now labeled Bridezilla, and I think we've even seen some reality shows called Bridezilla or something of that nature, and they're pretty horrendous, the behavior that you see. And I think that, listeners, if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like, oh, my God, my friend is, I knew she was vocal and I knew she's opinionated, but this is getting out of control, it's like, what would be the suggestion that we could give to listeners right now if that's what the situation is that they're dealing with? Whatever, because the Bridezilla could have all these demands. So it's not just hair color. It could be all kinds of demands that they're making. I don't know what's the worst demands that you've heard, but what would be some suggestions for our listeners about that?
A suggestion for listeners coming from the bride side, too, the bride who's thinking, this girl is throwing off my aesthetics for the wedding and I need her to change her hair, is to be flexible. You can only control so much on your big day, and out of all of the grand scheme of it, hair color may not be the one that you want to stress over. So having that flexibility when it comes to wedding planning and what you can control and what you can't control. And I think when it goes into having that conversation with a bridezilla about whatever grievance they've done or however you're feeling, is to be honest. There's nothing worse than not being honest when you go into a difficult conversation, but also being understanding and letting them know, I know you're planning a wedding. I understand that there's a lot of things going on, that you're juggling a lot of different details, but I just wanted to share with you how I'm feeling about X, Y, and Z, and this is why I'm feeling about X, Y, and Z, and see if you can have that open dialogue and that conversation that can hopefully create some type of resolution for both of you.
Absolutely. And I would agree with that. I mean, entirely. And again, I'll reiterate what I said before, just about preparation. I think thinking further in advance about certain things such as, color scheme and, look at the big picture early on. I had a similar situation with tattoos, and I made the decision about the kind of bridesmaids dresses I wanted to have because I wanted certain tattoos covered on my bridesmaids. Not that I don't like tattoos, but I felt that they could sometimes be distracting in wedding pictures, so I opted for a different kind of bridesmaids dress, and the bridesmaids dresses I went with were beautiful. So I think just thinking of the big picture and try to think, about all the different details that go into stuff can also definitely help with brides planning their weddings.
Very good. But so those are things to be thoughtful of. And the thing about it is not only have this honest conversation and really be thoughtful of how this is going to impact your best friends, people that you've asked to be part of your wedding. These are presumably people that you have a strong connection to, a best friend, long time, history with, family members. Obviously, they mean something to you. So, communicate in that honest and authentic way. Don't demand right off the bat. They want to be there for you. They want to support you. There's a lot that goes into being a bridesmaid and to being a bride. And, of course, there's a lot of stress that a bride is under. So the thing about it is be clear about what those expectations are and how are you going to communicate those expectations in a way that is, dare I say, loving, but if you don't like that word, listeners, how can you do it in a way that really honors, your friends, your family member, your sister, whoever it is that's part of that bridal party, and being really honest about what you need, and even if that means hiding tattoos. It's not about that you don't honor tattoos or who they are, but again, it's this vision. So how do you have that conversation? So very interesting. Let's see, I just want to make sure we didn't have any callers in the line. Okay, great. So we'll just continue on here. Anything else coming to mind in terms of, really difficult brides, for example?
I think also what's helpful in those situations that are high emotion is to practice having that conversation with someone else who's not directly impacted, someone who's completely neutral, removed from the situation, and practice on them what you're going to say to the other person and then see how it lands. And then that way you can continue tweaking it before you actually have the difficult conversation with the other person.
I agree.
And did either of you find that you had to have some difficult or tenseful conversations with your bridal party? I mean, you don't have to reveal confidentiality or anything, but did you feel that you were put in that position?
I didn't have to have a conversation with anybody in my bridal party. I had to have difficult conversations more with my extended family, my grandmother and my parents, and I had to have some conversations every once in a while. But I mean, for the most part, it was my parents weren't that bad. But with my grandmother, I had to have a serious conversation where we had to discuss expectations.
Okay.
And I would say the same thing for my bridal party. I didn't have any difficult conversations. Everything was pretty smooth sailing and seamless. And it could have been because my bridesmaids are all across the U.S., so we all came to one point the week of the wedding, opposed to getting together in different times and being involved in a lot of the planning. So I really didn't have any difficult conversations. By the time I saw them, they were ready to go, super supportive, really excited. I did have difficult conversations with family members, and for some of those difficult conversations, I did talk through it with my husband. We did talk about the reason why we felt a certain way, the reason why we thought something should be done that way, and how we were going to talk to that family member about our thoughts and our feelings on something.
Family members do bring up a lot of rich opportunities for conflict when it comes to engagement parties, rehearsal dinner, this positioning of who is important or more important, especially when you're dealing with, blended families, remarried parents, all of it's so many opportunities for that. I know when I remember very much, I had hired a bridal coordinator. And she was working with me on a number of things, and she knew there was a very interesting dynamic, which was my mother and my stepmother. Both of them have passed. And my mother was not one that I grew up with. I didn't even meet her until I was 27 years old. But she had entered my life several years before I actually got married, let's say 3 years before I got married. So we were re-engaging and building a relationship. I hadn't even met her. I mean, I was a baby when she left. So she had re-entered my life, and then there was my stepmother, who I also did not spend a lot of time growing up with. I grew up with my grandmother. So it was a very interesting dynamic because she was my mother, my biological mother, was invited to the wedding, and it was going to be the first time that she had seen my father in how many ever years, 30 years. First time she was seeing my grandmother who raised me. And so there was this prep work that had to be done on all the parts before she arrived about, expectations. There's the standard, what does she look like? What's her attitude? Are they going to fight like cats and dogs? And I'm envisioning stepmother and mother fighting on the floor, pulling out each other's hair. And I'm like, okay, is that going to happen? All those crazy things, So there was a lot of prep work. There was a lot of individual conversations with dad, individual conversations with stepmother, individual conversations with grandmother, individual conversations with my older sister. All of those things in order to prepare. And really everyone was very, very respectful, curious. They were all curious about each other, what had happened. Now, did they all sit at a table and like, hey, tell me about the last 30 years of your life? No. They were at different tables, but it was also I also had to be very careful about not making one more important than the other so that it didn't sound like I was positioning, right? Like it's like watching Survivor, right? Who's going to vote out who, or who's taking so-and-so to the award challenge because that means they're more important than the other person. So I had to be very thoughtful about all of those dynamics. But the one thing that I wasn't prepared for was my bridal coordinator, who knew some of this. We had flower arrangements, right? And so we got to keep them, and of course, I wanted to give them to certain family members. And so I told the bridal coordinator, I want this to go to this person and this go to this person, and et cetera. Well, I told her I wanted this particular thing to go to my biological mother, but she was distracted that day. She had a serious family concern that day, so she really wasn't focused, and she got so confused that she ended up making this big presentation to my stepmother in front of my biological mother, which positioned my stepmother to be really, really important over everybody else, and it caused conflict. And I thought, oh, my God, I can't believe this is happening. And then trying to figure out how to react to that and how do I deal with this in this moment, and, now having to, all these hurt feelings, and so managing all of that, so the bridal coordinator was someone I didn't even think of really being super clear with. So that's that extra person you don't often think about, in those kind of dynamics. But, yeah, family members can really add to the mix, and you have to really be prepared to not react, to respond in constructive ways. So anyways, that was a long story, but that was something after all these years. My husband and I have been married almost 24, 25 years now, and that still sticks out as one of the major conflicts that had occurred, during the wedding itself, and it was really sad, but I think, it took a couple of years for a couple of people to get over it, and that was sad too, and so hurt feelings do happen a lot of times, and it doesn't have to be that way. So it's amazing how time flies by. Now, there was one other quick post, and I'm going to, listeners, I'm going to give this to you through our Twitter chat. Conflict chat is our hashtag, and you can find some of these links not only through our Twitter feed, but you can also find that at the TexasConflictCoach.com. We have a special page called the Conflict Chat, and you'll find these links there. And this kind of goes to what Christy was saying around, what if you, something happens at the wedding with a vendor that maybe they promised the stars and the moon and they didn't come through, or they didn't come through to the extent that you were wanting. And so a lot of people now with social media and online presence are putting these reviews, right? You can go to Yelp and review people, or what are other sites that people do reviews? Yelp is one of them, but what's another one?
Wedding Wire is a big one, The Knot.
Wedding Wire, The Knot, Wedding Bee.
So all of those are kind of review type of places. See, I never even heard of those. So people, did y'all post? Did y'all post reviews on your vendors?
Absolutely.
We had one of our
reviews.
we had one of our vendors actually refer a couple to us when they weren't sure whether or not they should use them or not. So we actually talked to a couple on the phone.
Okay, so reviews we know for those who've used these types of reviews for specifically for weddings, but also for people who are familiar with Yelp with restaurant reviews and stuff like that. The idea is to post both positive and negative, and hopefully in a way that's constructive. But I've read some reviews that are pretty darn nasty. And what was interesting is on the Bridal Guide, it's a blog called the Bridal Guide, and it says, "Can you be fined for posting a negative wedding vendor review?" Now, I've never heard of people being fined for putting up an honest review, and apparently the Union Street Guest House, according to this blog in New York, wanted to fine the newlyweds $500 for every negative review that they posted online. And, of course, this just caused all kinds of problems and controversy, out there in the social world about people being fined. Had you ever heard about that, being fined?
I had never heard about that. I was very surprised when I read that, a $500 fine for posting a negative review. That shocked me.
I agree. That's new to me.
Yeah, it was very surprising, and I've actually heard of, I don't know if it's, and maybe because this is a hotel, but I've heard of other people saying that they've been fined. It says here, let's see here, It says the management's reason is that your guests may not understand what we offer, therefore we expect you to explain that to them. As an old but restored building, the rooms are designed to look old in an artistic vintage way, and they contain hip period furniture that you would see in any design magazine. And customers have been venting about their frustrations about the policy and yet for the past year. So it wasn't until the media outlets like Reddit, here we go, Reddit's pretty popular in the young crowd, and the New York Post, that's when they started, the controversy got really heated. And so they said they've had over 900 one-star reviews have been posted on Yelp in the past 2 days, which many of them have been deleted. So apparently these places, like some of these hotels, have these policies, and that says you will be fined if you give a negative review. So it seems like it goes against all about, freedom of the press and freedom of speech and all of that kind of stuff. So that was interesting.
That actually might go into something that you would not normally think of when it comes to wedding planning, right? I would have never thought that if I wrote a review, it could come back at me and I would be fined. But that might be something that brides want to think about moving forward when they're wedding planning, is to ask, do you have a social media policy? If I leave a review, what happens? Does someone check the review sites, or just to learn and understand a little bit about what their policies are and what their expectations are of reviews? That way you don't end up in the situation that couple was in.
Yeah, and apparently because this was part of the contract and part of the policy, they still went ahead and posted the review, which is why they, fined them for that. Actually, I do recall now what I was thinking of. It was actually doctors in the medical profession that were fining their patients the same type of fine for posting negative reviews. That was their policy. But the question that they posed in the blog, and I would question, if that was a policy, would I want to hire them as a vendor?
And see, that was what stuck out in my mind about the whole situation, because on one hand I could see where the vendors would be coming from, because especially in the hotel situation, you're going to have people that come in who maybe were expecting it to be more modern or comfy beds, and they'll post that kind of stuff as a negative review, like, oh, the beds or the furniture was weird and wasn't comfy. Well, that's not. It goes back to the expectation thing. So have your expectations met. Look online. I mean, you can't help, I guess, what all your guests say, but as far as the bride and groom go, take a tour of the vendors and meet with the vendors, ask for references, read through your contracts. The wedding industry is so competitive now that everybody kind of wants a piece of the pie. So it's definitely important to just make sure that you're reviewing your contracts and looking looking through things and taking a tour and all of that, just to manage your own expectations so nothing is surprising when you get to meet with your vendors. And another point I was going to make was that, there's red flags, I think, when you meet with a certain vendor, and you can tell if there's going to be something a little off and if something might not go as well. And I actually experienced that with a florist I met with. She disliked an idea that I had for the male boutonnieres, and she kept suggesting things that we should do. And so I immediately kind of got this gut reaction, like, I don't think this is going to work out well. So I think bride and grooms need to trust their gut, really, because when something's a little weird, or off, or you're not going to mesh well. So I think trusting your gut is definitely really important where brides and grooms are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of close this conversation, it kind of goes back to what Christy Aslan said, the wedding lawyer, is, one, make sure you have a contract in the first place, especially with your big vendors, cakes, photography, the facilities, whatever that is, your band. Actually have a contract in writing, and absolutely make sure to read that contract. Now, the clause, which is this disparagement clause, these apparently it's becoming more frequent. Part of these types of contracts, these service agreements between wedding professionals and brides, these are becoming much more frequent and common. So definitely, brides, be aware of that. Now, it only binds the bride and the groom. It does not bind their family, their friends, or their wedding guest from posting negative reviews on, a facility, for example, or whatnot. So it doesn't bind them. But, yeah, definitely read your contract, understand the contract, and if that's not something you're comfortable with, then that probably is not going to be the place for you to either use or to utilize that individual, for example. So again, lots of really great strategies and thoughts about when it's after the fact, right? And it goes back to also another thing is have that, even if it's after the fact, try to have that conversation with a vendor, right? Because maybe you had a bad experience or you had a different expectation. There's nothing wrong with still not having a conversation that, as you said, Tracy, is not about attacking or blaming, but still having a conversation that you approach in a way that is responsive. It lets them know what your needs are, what that your disappointments were, and it hopefully becomes as Christy said, a learning conversation so that it doesn't happen again for somebody else. And that way you get to feel like you've said what you needed to say, but in a way that could be heard and understood from the vendor. So any last thoughts for the two of you before we close the conflict chat for tonight?
I would just say that the biggest piece for me and just for this whole month is be prepared. Do your homework. Do your due diligence. Have conversations. Have open conversations with your spouse, with your family, with your friends when it comes to planning the wedding. And enjoy it and have fun. There may be some roadblocks that you may hit, but you can get through them if you just have a conversation about it and you do your homework and you have an understanding of what it is you want. I think oftentimes a lot of conflict happens with vendors when you don't go to them with an idea or a vision of what you want. So then they take some liberties because they're not really sure exactly what you want them to do. And then there's that disconnect when you don't really like a particular centerpiece or you don't like the way the cake came out. So it's really about having those conversations, being prepared, and just enjoying it. It's a wonderful experience being married and getting married, and have fun.
Wonderful.
And just to piggyback off of what Tracy just said, just make sure that you're organized and you communicate and you not be afraid to ask as many questions as possible. And don't be afraid of being labeled a bridezilla, because I think people use that word a little too loosely nowadays too. So don't assume, like what Tracy was saying, don't assume that people are going to know your vision. You have to communicate it, and as clear as you can get it and communicate as much as possible to your vendors, you'll be a happy person for your wedding and days afterwards too. And it is, like Tracy said, it is a wonderful experience getting married. It was an awesome experience planning my wedding and then just experiencing the day. So be in the moment and enjoy it.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, not to let those things take over the wedding so that you regret the way that you felt, either the way you felt or even how you reacted, and so that you can just really, really enjoy that experience. Well, I want to thank the two of you for hosting such a great series this month for the Texas Conflict Coach and really sharing with listeners a whole area that we've not done on our podcast, on our radio program for the last, since 2009. It's a really new series, and Abby, I think you might have a niche to go into. This is a very
yes,
ample
absolutely.
area for services for conflict management professionals. So I can see you in lights already, Abby, being an expert in the wedding arena. So thank you again for being here, and listeners, thank you for being part of our lives, our family, and tuning in every Tuesday. If you didn't get a chance to listen to any of the wedding series, just go to the TexasConflictCoach.com. We have over 287 podcasts in our library. You'll scroll down and you'll find it in the family section, and we'll say wedding conflict, and you can listen to those past episodes there. Everyone, we encourage you to embrace conflict courageously and address it constructively. So until next time, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you enjoyed the program. You can find all of our podcasts archived to listen at your convenience at TexasConflictCoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. You can also become a Facebook fan of Conflict Connection or Twitter me at TX Conflict Coach.